place in different eras.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel responsible for doing the research and making sure you're not exploiting certain things as a writer, or do you just write stories?
Well, I certainly, if I'm doing historical fiction, I feel a real responsibility to get it right. And I always try to get somebody who knows more than I do to read it and to make sure I've gotten it right. So I have, I certainly have that kind of feeling of responsibility. When I'm writing the story, I'm not really thinking about a reader, but when I begin to rewrite, then of course I have to begin to think, well, now who is going to read this book? I'm always a little bit amazed. Somebody was talking about how much her third graders like Bridge to Terabithia. I think third graders are awfully young to be reading, because even though it's not that difficult to read, I'm not arguing that it's intellectually too hard for them. I'm saying emotionally. When you're 8 years old, you need a happy ending. And to give a book to a kid who's not ready for the death of a friend, that doesn't make me very happy when I hear that. Of course, I don't have control once it leaves my hands as to who's going to read it. And I'm not going to tell people they can't read my book. I never told my children they couldn't read a book of anybody's. But I tried to be there when I knew they were reading something that was tough. And if I knew they were reading something that was probably something that would worry me, I read it myself so we could talk about it. And I think parents have a lot of responsibility in that regard, too.
Absolutely, like that's something we've definitely talked about, and many people have come on the I'm tongue-tied right now, but well, everybody's pretty much been saying, it's really important for the parent to be there.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily. A big thing we've been talking about is Gossip Girls, these new books that are, about fashion and being cool, and it's kind of the it thing now. And kids very young are reading these books. And when we first started this project, we were like, okay, what's the danger of that? Is that a bad thing? Could kids be influenced a lot by these books, and could that affect them in their development? And we kind of realized that TV is probably going to outnumber what's going to happen in a book, and if anything, TV is going to destroy or create those stereotypes and those thoughts in kids more than that of a book, and the danger really isn't in the book. But still, concepts in a book are very powerful, and it seems to be communication with parents, or parents communicating with their kids and understanding what their kids are reading, whether it be a really hard-hitting book when they're really young, or not so hard-hitting.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask you about how you parented your children and how you were there for them, and you already answered what I was going to ask. And did you ever say, no, you can't read this book?
No, I never. My own parents, who are very conservative Presbyterian missionaries, never told me I couldn't read a book. And I thought that was a very good system, because a lot of things I self-censored. I would start reading a book and I would either not be interested because I didn't understand what was going on, or I'd stop reading because it was too scary. So I think a lot of times children, if they're allowed to read freely, will do that. In fact, I've had children tell me, well, I stopped reading Bridge to Terabithia because somebody told me that Leslie died and I didn't want to read that. And I think that's fine. I think that means they know they're not ready for something, and they're wise enough to put it off. And so I followed that same pattern with my own children. But as I say, when I knew it was tough, or they were reading Forever by Judy Blume, and all four of them were passing it around. The youngest was 8. So I thought, I better read this book. There's too much giggling going on in this house.
That's a big book we've been talking about too. And did you read that one yourself, and did you sit, your kids down and say, hey, this is what's going on, this is what it's about?
I don't remember sitting them down as such. But I wanted to be there for the questions.
Absolutely. Do you think it seems that there's been an upward trend of fantasy and with Harry Potter that's really brought out the genre, and also books that are a little more like the Gossip Girl series and Twilight, and Twilight ties in with the fantasy too. And do you think that those books is it okay for kids to be reading books that aren't necessarily things that are gonna further their education in any way?
Well, I read a lot of trash when I was young. It didn't scar me for life. I think it's important to, and I think this is where parents reading to their children and teachers reading aloud comes in, because if you're reading aloud, you get to choose. And what I did was choose the best, so that the kids would have something to compare it with. And then if they read trash, they knew what was good and what was trash. You could develop some judgment that way. So I'm not overly concerned about kids reading books that aren't first-class literature. One thing is that you develop a facility in reading that way. You just, if you one of the hardest things about reading is moving from that stage where you're just working it out to the stage where you're just not even thinking about it. It's like learning to drive at first. Shifting gears or something like that just seems like, oh, I'll never learn this. And then you come to the stage where you don't even think about it. It's all part of your unconscious. And so what you want the child to do is to move from the shifting gears painfully stage to the time where you can enjoy driving. And unless you do a lot of reading, then you can't move very quickly from one stage to the other. So sometimes you have to read very easy, trashy books to get to that stage.
It seems that there was a trend in literature for a while in the 80s where issue books were very popular, and it was the thought of we must educate our youth. They are the future of, us. Mm-hmm. And it seems like things have steered away from that, and people understand that, kids want to read for fun too. I mean, there's the trashy beach novel is something the adult loves, and so does the kid.
Look and see what people are reading on airplanes. Not too many of them are improving their minds.
It's passing the time. Do you think, let's see, there's an economic divide concerning literacy?
Well, money provides opportunity. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that the rich take advantage of those opportunities. In fact, our son David lives in Manhasset, New York, on Long Island, which is a very, very wealthy community. And he was appalled when he took his oldest, he's the home, he's a writer, so he's the home parent. And when he took his oldest to the testing for kindergarten in this very, very rich town, he said, "Mom, most of those kids weren't ready." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, they didn't know their letters. They certainly didn't know their alphabet. They didn't know their colors. They didn't know shapes." And I said, "At 5 years old, they didn't know these things that you're supposed to, you think every child knows about this stuff?" He said, "They're raised by non-English speaking nannies who don't even speak Spanish to them. Their parents are out of the house." And so you'd think people like that would have a great head start in literacy, but if you don't do it, it's not done. If you leave your kid to be educated by the TV or the computer, you don't get what reading to them and talking to them is going to give them, because that's where you learn language, is by being talked to and read to.
Wow, that's fascinating right there. We are going to be speaking with a psychologist, a developmental psychologist at UVM, and just to talk about like what's important at certain stages of development and why reading is very important to people, because that's really what humanity has that other species don't, and that makes us what we are. So reading, we're kind of trying to get at the heart of what literacy is and why it's important, essentially.
Yeah.
But I find that really fascinating.
Yeah.
Have you seen the movie Spellbound?
No.
The one about the spelling bee? No.